Hello and welcome to an election special on Spectator TV, and it's not going to be about the general election, but the European elections which are taking place this week. If Britain hadn't voted for Brexit, we would also be voting in these elections, but perhaps thank God for everyone, we are not. I am delighted to be joined by no less than the Spectator's chairman, Andrew Neil. Andrew, thank you for coming on Spectator
Pleasure.
TV.
Great to be here.
Let's start by asking probably the sort of most obvious question. Are these European elections important? Do they matter? Because to a lot of people, they don't seem to have any real democratic purpose.
I don't think they matter in the sense that they're going to change ordinary people's lives. You know, you're not changing a government or anything like that. It's not going to affect the standard of living or the cost of living crisis. But I think they do matter as a measure of the mood of Europe and of political trends. And they can have an impact on more important politics. I mean, it was because of how well UKIP did in the European elections that David Cameron ended up promising a referendum on Brexit. He wanted to shore up his flank against UKIP. Madame Le Pen in France has often put herself on the map by doing very well in the European elections. And this time, at a time in Europe when the mainstream left and right are in some trouble, and you've got the rise of a more populist right, this election will give us a measure of just how important that rise is, how widespread it is, how big it is, and how much a threat it is to the usual established way of Europe, which is very much a kind of Christian Democrat, social democrat consensus on the left and the right.
So would it be too cynical to describe it as really just a very convincing opinion poll?
It's a big opinion poll. I think that's right. It's a big, of course, it will probably determine who is going to be the next president of the Commission as well, because the Parliament has a say in that. And the European Parliament does some things. It has some powers as well. But as I say, I think it's more important for what impact it will then have on the domestic policies of individual countries. I think probably more important than any for France, because the way things are standing at the moment, it looks like Madame Le Pen's party will come first in France, and that will play in to the domestic politics in France, which is already very well established now. And of course, the presidential election is not that far away now. It's coming down the pike.
Yes, well, 2027.
27. It's a five-year French presidential term. There used to be 7 until Chirac.
Yes.
Chirac had the last 7-year term, and then his second term became 5 years.
Well, Gavin Mortimer's written a very interesting piece about the French situation in the magazine this week. But just before we get onto that, I wanted to ask about the sort of comparison between Britain and France at the moment politically. Because obviously we're about to have this general election. Everybody expects Labour to win. And that would be a movement left for Britain. Yes. Some might say not really going anywhere with the state of the Tory party and so on. But Europe certainly seems to be drifting right. And do you think because of Brexit, Britain is in a different place politically to a lot of Europe?
Well, I think it's certainly true that Britain's the odd one out at the moment. I mean, almost everywhere you look, mainstream social democratic parties are in some trouble. Obviously, the Italian one has been totally superseded by Madame Meloni. The Scholz coalition, the Social Democrats in Germany, are in real trouble. I mean, they're knocking lumps out of each other most of the time. And of course, the old Socialist Party in France barely exists anymore. So if you look at that and then look at what is about to happen in Britain, where our equivalent of a social democratic party is about to win probably a massive landslide, then you can see Britain's out of kilter. And I think our timing is that bit different. In some ways, you could say that Britain's populist right move was 2019, when Boris Johnson, on the back of getting Brexit done against a far-left Labour leader, broke into a lot of previously Labour working-class areas, got an 80-seat majority, looked at the time as a majority for 2 terms, and we were front-runners in what's been happening in Europe. But of course, Mr. Johnson managed to blow the whole thing up in his face after having began what looked like a major realignment on British politics, in which Labour became more bourgeois, more metropolitan, more white-collar, and the Tories became more provincial, more blue-collar, more working class. And that isn't necessarily a trend that's come to an end, but for the moment, it's come to a halt. And it's a trend that is happening in other countries, but not for the moment in ours.
Well, I suppose what's been different with Britain and the experiences of Britain and France is that in Britain, it's the established parties that perhaps because of our first past the post system, the established parties, the Tory parties, did adapt and did absorb that populist movement to a large extent. Whereas
Indeed, because they're grander coalitions, and if you want to get on in Britain with our first past the post system, it's a bit like the Democrats and Republicans too with their first past the post system. If you want to influence, you've basically got to join one of the coalition of the left or the coalition of the right, which is Labour and Conservative. Doing it as an outsider is pretty much impossible.
Well, we'll see how Reform do in the coming days. But on France, Gavin makes this interesting point in his piece that Macron knows he's in trouble in these elections. He's very unpopular at the moment.
Very unpopular.
The French are very worried about the economy. And he's pitched, which is something he's done before, a vote for Le Pen as a sort of vote for Putin. And I think it's been quite effective for him in the past as an argument. But polls certainly suggest, it looks though that's not washing of the French. The French aren't that thinking about Ukraine a lot at the moment. They're thinking about their own economy, their own problems, and immigration and so on. I
don't think it's worked for him. Partly because he's reached a situation where the French don't even want to listen to him.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the Tories in Britain. Doesn't matter what the Tories say, the British people don't really want to listen to them anymore. Their time has come and gone for now. But also I think it's because France is a bit down on itself at the moment. They're a bit gloomy, a bit miserable. They're worried about the economy. Of course, the credit ratings agencies just downgraded France, a bit like Britain.
Yeah.
But they take these things much more personally. Though they can always blame the evil Anglo-Saxon credit agencies for doing that in a way. And I think they're more concerned about themselves. They're not that worried about Ukraine. People don't talk about Ukraine in France very, very much. They're not against Ukraine. They're not Putin sympathizers by any means. But in a way that there's a big support for Ukraine in a political segment here or in the United States and obviously in Poland and even to some extent in Germany. It's not like that in France. And I mean, one of the things where France is now having to live is what Macron did in 2017. Which was he destroyed the centre-right and the centre-left. He destroyed the old Gaullist centre-left, the old party of Chirac, and he destroyed the Socialist Party. I mean, they both got less than 10% of the vote.
Yes.
I think one was down about 6%. I will never forget, on the night of the results coming in 2017, the first time Macron was elected, I was staying in a hotel up by the Jardin de Luxembourg, and I was broadcasting for CNN on the Champs-Élysées. And it was one of these beautiful Paris nights. And so I just thought, I'm just going to walk over. I'm in plenty of time. I'll have a lovely, what is not to like about walking through Paris in a beautiful summer's night. And my route took me that way past the Socialist Party headquarters, totally closed up.
Yeah.
Totally black at the windows, then past the Gaullists, just down from the National Assembly, totally closed. I mean, that would be like having a general election in Britain where the Tory party headquarters and the Labour Party headquarters had gone home.
Yes.
And not bothered to have the result. And neither the centre-left nor the centre-right in France have had a comeback.
Yes.
Which is what makes Madame Le Pen now the most interesting, because she is now the party of the right. She is now dominating that space on the right. And that's what makes, and Mr. Macron's coalition is now in decline. And that's what makes things a lot more unpredictable, or at least a lot more favourable to her.
Yes. So the exact opposite in 2017 of what was going on in Britain, of what we were just describing, of the parties expanding in Britain to absorb these movements, contracting and vanishing, in fact, in France.
Vanishing. I mean, it's quite remarkable. Between them, the Socialist Party and the Gaullist Party had had run the French Fifth Republic.
Yeah.
That was it. It was one of them in some kind of coalition. Sometimes they had to split things. President would be one party, the assembly would be another. Cohabitation, they used to call it. But by and large, these were the two parties. And now they weren't even contenders. And by 2022, again, when I was back in Paris for the results that night, they still weren't contenders.
Yes.
It was again, the second round was between Mr. Macron and Madame Le Pen for a second time. And although she still didn't win, as is pointed out in the article quite rightly, Mr. Macron, I think, got about 2 million fewer votes and she got 3 million more.
Well, and in that 2022 election, the Ukraine war was a very prominent factor because it was, Europe was quite frightened at that moment. And Macron was quite skillful in playing on that as a campaigner, wasn't he?
Yes, and I think they were worried that she was too close to the Kremlin.
Yeah.
And they brought up all these stories that at one stage she had been bankrolled by East European banks that were close to the Kremlin, which is true. Part of the problem, of course, was that French banks wouldn't lend to her for her campaign, so she didn't have too many other places to go. So he did play up to that. She's not a great debater. In the final big presidential debates, she didn't do that well. Mr. Macron did better than her. That helped to clinch it. The stars hadn't yet realigned in a way that made her possible to break through. I mean, there is a time when faced with Le Pen, the rest of the French political establishment comes together to stop Le Pen. I remember the first time when her father ran against Chirac. He got through to the second round. So it was Mr. Le Pen and Chirac. And the socialist campaign that time, I think, what would it be, 2000, 2001, their campaign slogan was, vote for the crook, not the fascist. In other words, Chirac's a crook, but vote for him. Don't vote Le Pen. He's a fascist. What is interesting this time is whether she's now big enough to see off that crowding out as everyone else gangs up against her. That's the interesting question.
Well, because she has grown in the last 3 election cycles, she's grown quite significantly, and it seems to be just a steady accumulation of support.
Bit by bit, she has shed what you might call a lot of the nasty baggage.
Yes.
Bit by bit, she has moved more to the mainstream. Bit by bit, she even got rid of her father from the party, who was pretty much a neo-Nazi. Was constantly being arrested for anti-Semitism and near Holocaust denial, in fact. And there were some Waffen SS characters in the early day of the National. I mean, don't forget, France was occupied by the Nazis. French people were rounded up, tortured and shot. It's not a great selling point of any link with the Nazis if you're trying to win an election in France. So, and bit by bit, she has shed that. She has made the party more mainstream. Of course, it still has elements of the right, still not, a mainstream centre right party, but she may have done enough to mainstream it, to make it now respectable in many people's eyes outside the French political elite, which will always hate her.
Well, and there's this very interesting figure who is the principal candidate in these European elections, of Jourdain Bardella.
Yes, a young man. Working class background.
Yeah.
Poor part of Paris. Unusual in we think in Britain we have a class system, but the French political elite is far more elitist than the British political system. And they all go to the same Grand École and all the rest of it, like Mr. Macron did too. They don't go to universities. The French universities are pretty useless. They all go to the Grand Écoles.
I think Jourdain Bardella dropped out of university.
So he didn't do that. And he seems to be appealing to the young. He doesn't need to appeal to working class votes because she's already had them. But again, he helps to broaden her appeal and helps to continue this process. I mean, where it ends up, I don't know. But you can look at a number of places now where there is a major realignment going on the right. And it is the demise of the traditional centre-right mainstream parties, the rise of a much more populist right, often starting out quite far on the hard right, and then, like Madame Le Pen, moving a bit more to the mainstream, if not quite returning to the mainstream. You can see that with the MAGA Republicans. I mean, the MAGA Republicans have basically launched and succeeded in a hostile takeover of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
It is Donald Trump's MAGA Republican Party. Now, the Mitt Romneys, the country club Republicans, they're all finished. Even the Reagan Republicans seem to be pretty finished. You see it with Le Pen in France as a realignment of the right into a more populist, less traditional, more working class right. You see it with Meloni in Italy as well, where she is the prime minister, and she has created a realignment on the right here. You see in other places where it's failed a bit. The AfD is not managing to pull that off in Germany. Vox has not managed to pull it off in Spain. And whereas Britain, which we've said, of course, is an outlier about to move to the left, but here's the thing. If the Tory party is pretty much wiped out or reduced to a rump, even if the Reform Party doesn't pick up many seats, which it probably won't, even if Mr. Farage doesn't win Clacton, which he might not, but I'm told he's got a better chance of it now. But what is to stop the Reform Party from mounting a hostile takeover of what's left of the Conservative Party?
You're not splitting the right, but swallowing it.
But swallowing it. I mean, either, as one Reform guy said to me, well, whether or not it's hostile, Andrew, depends on who the Tories pick as the next leader. Yeah. You know, if they pick someone like Suella Braverman, then it won't be a hostile takeover, it will be a merger.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, but if they pick a one nation Tory, if they pick another, quote, socialist, you know, because everyone's a socialist that doesn't agree with them, then, yeah, we could mount a hostile takeover. And although the smaller the Tory rump, the more one nation the MPs will be left. But that's not how you take over a party. You take over a party by the constituencies.
Yes.
You know, that's how Militant Tendency did it in the Labour Party all these years ago. And the constituency, the Tory constituencies are the people that gave us Liz Truss.
Yes.
They're not one nation Tories. So you could see a beginning of a more populist realignment on the right post this election. And if is possible, maybe even likely, it turns out Mr. Starmer and his shadow cabinet are out of the depth and it all begins to fall apart, then it'll be a more populist right that will be the main opposition.
Yeah, and so a sort of Trump-like swallowing.
More Trump-like, you know, in his own British way.
Trump with a British accent.
You know, Trump, you know, Nigel Farage said something quite clever a couple of nights ago. He said, you know, not everything crosses the Atlantic.
Yeah.
You know, and Mr. Trump does not cross the Atlantic.
Yes.
But you could see...
Nigel Farage crosses the Atlantic.
He crosses it a little bit better. At least he thinks he does. But you could see the makings of this with Boris Johnson's victory in 2019. You could see picking up all these seats, people whose families themselves had voted Labour all their life, suddenly voting Conservative. And the beginnings then of a new realignment, as I say, Mr. Johnson blew it. Keir Starmer has been quite... You know, this is the reason why Keir Starmer is wrapping himself in the flag. These former Labour voters, about, again, probably to become Labour voters, they're social conservatives and they're patriots. They believe in the defence of the nation. They believe in strong armed forces. They believe in Britain. And by and large, they've got very little time for wokery and a lot of the fashionable shibboleths of the of progressive social policy. And he's going out to get them. He's aiming for them now. He may succeed in holding on to them. I suspect that Labour will drag him more to the wokery side again. And these people who voted for Mr. Johnson in 2019 and almost certainly going to vote for Mr. Starmer this time round, could be up for grabs again in a new realigned right.
Well, and one thing Reform is certainly focusing on is Islamism.
Yes.
Or certainly, you know, the possibility of a future where there is a strong, coordinated Muslim vote, which frightens a lot of people. And that, of course, has been a huge thing for Le Pen. That's what a large part of what Le Pen campaigns on. It
has indeed. And of course, the whole Islamism issue is even bigger in France than it is in this country because a much bigger percentage of recent migrants and historic migrants coming from North Africa and France's old colonies in North Africa, a much higher percentage is Muslim. I mean, our historic migrant population tends to be much more varied. You know, a lot of Christians from Africa, Hindus,
Yes.
and so on.
And
of
without
course,
wanting to sound too sort of patriotic on the British side, Britain's had a better experience of integration because of our housing.
But again, perhaps because where our integration has failed most is actually in Muslim communities in the north that resemble the Muslim communities in the banlieue, in the suburbs around a lot of France's city. And of course, we had in the post-war, the original immigrant tranche was from the Caribbean. They were English-speaking. A lot of them had fought in the war for us, and they were Christian. So we've had less of a problem on that, but there is a problem in Britain now, a much bigger problem in France, and is fear of Islamism, fear of the Islamization is something that still gets that populist right out of bed in the morning. So you could see reform playing to that in the way Le Pen has played to it in France.
And finally, Andrew, given that Europe seems to be going right, as we said at the beginning, Europe seems to be going right, and Britain is sort of scrambled up, and yes, I could see what might be about to happen. But a lot of people who supported Brexit might be thinking, well, hang on, we've got completely the politics that we didn't want. Well, Europe seems, it's not quite an institutional takeover in Europe, but the European right, the Eurosceptic right, is almost coming to dominate Europe.
I think there's one thing you have to remember about the populist right in Europe, or even actually the populist right in this country, and certainly the MAGA Republicans. They are not small government Jeffersonians.
Yeah.
They are not market economy people. They're big government conservatives. You know, you look at the economic policies of Le Pen, they're not that different from the left in France. You know, big state control, high minimum wage, suspicion of capitalism, and so on. So there is almost no voice in Europe now for the market economy. No Thatcherite, no Reagan voice. Donald Trump is a big government conservative. Boris Johnson was a big government conservative as well. He never saw an infrastructure program he didn't like. He wants even a bridge to Ireland. You couldn't be more bonkers than, oh yeah, let's look at that feasibility plan for a bridge to. So I think that's one thing that you have to remember about the populist right. This is not a return to Reaganism or Thatcherism or anything like that. This is a very different kind of conservatism, a very different kind of big government conservatism in there. Given that the Labour Party is a kind of big government party too, in some ways you still have a kind of consensus towards how you run the economy. And at the moment, as you look across Europe, or even America, who now makes the case for the market economy?
Well, I suppose some people within the Republican Party still.
But the
some people
voice is diminished, isn't it?
Well, and if you look at Eric Zemmour, who's sort of further to the right on Le Pen on immigration, he was more of a small government conservative on the economics, and he has not succeeded. Not succeeded.
And of course, originally AfD in Germany were more free market economists who were against the euro. And of course, they've gone much more nativist now, and dropped the kind of intellectual economics element to it. One of the remarkable things, two of the remarkable things of Brexit now, as we sit here, I would say are this. One, for whether you were for or against it, it's broken the Tory party. It's broken the Tory party. The Brexiteers won. Majority were Conservative. But getting it, doing it, living with it afterwards has broken them. It's exhausted them. It's taken away all their bandwidth. They had no time. And then, of course, the pandemic came along and that made it doubly difficult. But it's a bit like the Corn Laws in the 1840s. The repeal of the Corn Laws destroyed that Conservative Party as we knew it, and a new one had to rise from the ashes. Brexit has destroyed the Conservative Party as we've known it. It's divided it, it's exhausted it, it's made it almost childish as they change leader after leader, and the Prime Ministership becomes a game of Tory musical chairs. And I think that's a legacy that could be it could be a long while putting Humpty Dumpty together again. And the second thing I would say on this Brexit business, as a consequence, for reasons I still don't quite understand, but the pandemic and the Ukraine war had a lot to do with it, and Boris Johnson had a lot to do with it, that you then saw the rise of big government conservatism as well at the same time. Boris Johnson was a big government conservative. Wars produce big government. Pandemics produce big governments as well. That's the response that is demanded of big government has to save us. We need to fight a war. Got to beat the other side. And you're someone like Boris Johnson. I don't see that is going to change very much in the near future. And the consequence has been that by leaving the European Union, but falling into this big government way of doing things now, the more we've left Europe, the more we've become like Europe. Our tax has been moving towards European levels in terms of a share of the GDP. Our public spending has certainly moved towards European levels, up there at 46, 47% of GDP. That's within the European mainstream now. And so the irony of the Brexit vote is that as an economy, I mean, Singapore on Thames, whatever happened to that, baby? It's just gone. And one of the remarkable and unpredictable consequences of the Brexit vote is it's made us more than ever like a European economy.
Andrew Neil, we'll end it there. Thank you very much. Merci.
Merci à vous.
And please, I shouldn't say please come on Spectator TV again. You're the chairman. You'll be back on in no time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.